Well, New York State Governor Andrew Cuomo has ordered tighter restrictions as COVID-19 cases hit the 7,000 mark there. Now, more than 4,000 of those in New York City. Businesses across the state are now required to send their workers home, and people have been told to stay indoors as much as possible. The provisions will take effect on Sunday night. Let's chat more about this with our New York correspondent, William Densler. William, thanks so much for your time. So just give us a little more detail on these tighter restrictions.
Absolutely. Of course, when we spoke about a week ago, we saw the announcement from New York that all bars and restaurants were moving purely to a takeout and delivery mode. Now, this step goes even further. This essentially means that all non-essential businesses will be forced to close. Now, the message from Andrew Cuomo, New York's governor, is that this is not based on volunteering. This is absolutely mandatory. He says that civil fines and mandatory closures may be needed if these aren't properly enforced by these businesses. Now, this doesn't mean that all businesses will be closing. By no means. We still understand that restaurants will be allowed to continue as long as they're only providing deliveries. There'll also be essential services when this includes the likes of banks will remain open, pharmacies, laundry services, as well as things like childcare, animal care as well. So there are some provisions, but this is seen as another very strict steps from New York as they attempt to flatten this curve. There is real concern from New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo. We've seen a huge spike, over 2,000 new cases now confirmed in New York State. The message from officials here is that these strict measures are absolutely essential to prevent a healthcare crisis in the state and indeed across the country.
So did he say, William, whether this will be indefinitely? Has he given a bit of a deadline for this, or saying, you know, let's go a couple of weeks and see how we go?
Well, that's the real message. Of course, the hope is that this will just be a few weeks in the making, but no strict guidelines when it comes to deadlines have been announced. Of course, the message from New York's officials is they want to see this curve start to flatten. They've come out and said that they want to tighten the valve. That was a metaphor used by Andrew Cuomo. He said that they will need to keep tightening this valve. That could mean potentially in the future more stricter stay-at-home procedures as opposed to what we've seen now come into effect here in New York. So the message from officials that they are prepared to go even further to get these cases under control. But as things stand, they're tightening slowly to try and really get this under control. The hope is from officials that these kind of measures will keep more and more New Yorkers off the streets, away from public gatherings and public meetings such as their places of work, in the hope that that works. But of course, if it doesn't have the desired effect, they will be prepared, they say, to go with even stricter enforcement. The message from officials that there simply aren't enough ventilators, aren't enough ICU beds and things like that to prepare for a healthcare emergency that New York is preparing for. There's the possibility of a Navy healthcare ship to arrive here in the city as preparations really get underway for a potential worst-case scenario.
And I suppose the other concern here, William, will be about, you know, people making a living. Now, what does this mean if they're sent home, if no work is being done? What happens to salaries? What happens to how they will live in this time?
Yeah, this is obviously a huge ramification, a reason why the federal government has been somewhat reluctant to see these measures take effect across the country. There are warnings, according to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin, that the unemployment rate in the United States could rise as high as 20%. These really not seen levels since the 1930s and the Great Depression here in the US. Huge concerns. We've heard from Andrew Cuomo speaking at this news conference in Albany, the state capital, on Friday. He's come out and said that there will be certainly a temporary halt to people being evicted from their places of residence and businesses for at least a couple of months to really stop the hardships being felt as much as possible. Of course, we've seen state measures come into effect when it comes to trying to provide some economic stimulus. Of course, we have this US government proposing $1 trillion to help the likes of small businesses, even individual paychecks sent to Americans across the country to help ease this economic burden. But even in the US, we see interest rates now near zero. But the fact of the matter is that while businesses like here in New York remain shuttered, while you still don't have access to go see your favourite sports team play, you can't go to theatre or Broadway here in New York, then that cuts off a number of streams of revenue. So while interest rates might be low, people don't really have the ability to spend money. Of course, that spells bad news for the US economy.
So this being done in New York City at the moment, William, but what about, other cities? What about other states? Do we know about similar restrictions there?
Well, absolutely. We just had news just 24 hours ago from California, of course, the most populous state in the United States. That affects around 40 million people there will now be under a shelter-at-home enforced procedure. So that is seen as the strictest move being taken in the United States so far as they try and get their COVID-19 epidemic under control there. So that is a huge step being taken by the state of California. We've seen similar measures across parts of the country, but of course it does depend where exactly you are. Of course, not each state has seen the same levels of cases. California and New York are certainly seen as huge outbreak hotspots here in the country, but measures of similar kinds are being taken. Of course, the likes of shutting bars and restaurants to moving to takeout only has been seen as a very commonplace across the country. The likes of cinemas, gyms closing across the United States as well, very common. So this is something that's really impacting workers in the US economy, no matter where you are, no matter just how bad the epicenter is in your particular neighborhood, your community or even state that you're in. This is certainly having a major impact on people's daily lives.
All right, uncharted territory for us all over the world. Thanks very much for that, William Denslow there, our New York correspondent.